It is the Resistance Report for April 17th, 2017. Tomorrow is tax day, the deadline for most Americans to pay their 2016 taxes. It's the perfect day, isn't it, for Donald Trump to release his tax returns? I would think that for a showman like Donald Trump, he could do it in a big way and get a lot of attention. Every president has done it, not with a great deal of showmanship, but since Richard Nixon, for the past 40 years, every president has produced his tax returns, made them public. But today, Sean Spicer, the extraordinarily articulate, mild-mannered communications secretary for Donald Trump, said that Donald Trump won't release his tax returns. Quote, "It's been covered before. It's the same thing that was discussed during the campaign trail. The president is under audit. It's a routine audit that continues." This must be the longest routine audit in history, folks. Asked whether Trump would authorize the IRS to even confirm the existence of this so-called long routine audit, Spicer didn't answer. He just said, "Nothing has changed. The American people understood when they elected him in November." Understood? Understood what? That we'd elect a president who would go into hiding? Tonight's theme is secrecy, by the way. Cover-ups. Now, Donald Trump has said repeatedly, in January 2016, that's more than 15 months ago, he told NBC News that even though he had very big returns, unquote, he would, quote, absolutely, unquote, release his information to the public once everything was approved, and it would be very beautiful. That's a direct quote. But then he claimed that because of this IRS audit, he just couldn't release his returns, but he would release them as soon as the audit was complete. But here is the thing you ought to keep in mind. Audits don't stop presidents from releasing their returns. Presidents and vice presidents are automatically subject to audits by the virtue of the fact that they are presidents and vice presidents, but that has never stopped them, certainly since the days of Richard Nixon, from releasing their taxes. In fact, the IRS has said very explicitly, quote, "Nothing prevents individuals from sharing their own tax information," unquote, including being under an audit. So the only reasonable question, it seems to me, is what is Donald Trump trying to hide? Either A, conflicts of financial interest even larger than we know about, or B, debts to Russian oligarchs that we can dream of, imagine, but maybe we need to know about them, or 3, C, illegal business dealings. What else could he be hiding? And that notion of I'm president so I can do anything I want has also come to the fore. Protesters who were beat up at a Trump campaign rally last year, they sued Donald Trump, claiming that he urged his supporters to assault them. And this past Friday, Trump's lawyers responded, how? In very Trump-like fashion. They said, quote, "Mr. Trump is immune from lawsuit because he is President of the United States," unquote. Hello? Now, these alleged insightful remarks that caused people to get beat up were made before he became president. So is the idea of the lawyers that whatever he has done before he became president, he is now immune from lawsuit? And by the way, we also know that presidents are not immune from Wall Street, from lawsuits, Wall Street or otherwise. Even a sitting president is not immune from civil lawsuits unrelated to their official duties. See Clinton versus Jones, 1997. Bottom line is that Donald Trump's "I'm president so I can do what I like" argument is baloney. Meanwhile, secretly, Donald Trump is seeking advice from big corporations about what regulations ought to be rolled back because they burden corporate profits. Now, as somebody who once ran the Department of Labor, which is listed as the second most irksome department to businesses, second only to the Environmental Protection Agency, let me just make some simple points. First, corporations will not voluntarily protect workers if they can make more money by not protecting them. And I could give you a long list of examples: mine disasters, other kinds of disasters, people losing limbs and arms and their lives. When I was labor secretary, we worked on that, trying to stop corporations, trying to lift the penalties higher and higher. Ditto for consumers. That is, corporations will not protect consumers if there's more money to be made by not protecting consumers, and you have only to look at, what, United Airlines, or maybe Wells Fargo, or some price gouging by Big Pharma. And they will not protect investors if there's money to be made by not protecting investors, and you've only to look at what Wall Street has been up to for years and years. And the other point I want to make is that there are only 3 constraints on big corporations in terms of not taking advantage of workers and consumers and investors if there's a lot of profit to be made. Number 1 is a competitive market. That is, if the firm is in tight competition, rigorous competition, vigorous competition with some other company, then obviously it's possible for customers, consumers, and maybe even workers and investors to go to another company that's more responsible. The problem is that in airlines and in banking and many other businesses, we have less and less competition. Chances are the nearest bank to you is probably Wells Fargo. Chances are, going through your town or your city, there may be no plane, no airline, no carrier other than United. So you can't exercise much consumer choice in a world where there is mergers and acquisitions and consolidation. Now, the second constraint on big corporations that might otherwise want to take advantage of workers and consumers and investors is the threat of lawsuits. But you may have noticed in consumer contracts and in labor contracts and investor contracts, more and more corporations are insisting in the fine print on what is called mandatory arbitration, with an arbitrator chosen by the corporation. You can't even go to court. And so what's left? If you don't have competition and you don't have lawsuits, what is your method as a consumer or as a worker or as an investor for keeping a corporation in line when they can make more money by abridging your rights? That only leaves regulation. And if Donald Trump is intent with big business and with Wall Street on getting rid of regulations that protect health and safety and the environment, consumers, workers, and investors, then there is nothing standing between us and corporate greed. Which leads to the White House. With Stephen Bannon on the way out, official Washington is jumping for joy that Gary Cohn, who's the former president of Goldman Sachs and now in charge of the National Economic Council, along with other influential Goldman Sachs alumni in the White House, like Dina Powell, that they are now supposedly taking over Trump's brain. CNBC says Cohn will push, quote, more moderate, business-friendly economic policies. The Washington Post says the growing strength of Cohn and like-minded moderates are moving Trump much closer to the views of, quote, mainstream Republicans and Democrats, unquote. In reality, Cohn, Powell, and other Wall Streeters and CEOs around Trump are pushing Trump to be closer not to mainstream Republicans and Democrats per se, but closer to Wall Street and big corporations. And to the extent that that means that they are closer to mainstream Republicans and Democrats is only because mainstream Republicans and Democrats are dependent on Wall Street and big business for campaign donations. I am not convinced, by the way, that tax breaks for the rich and subsidies for big corporations are so much better than Bannon-type xenophobia. I mean, is this the real choice and only choice we face as a nation? Corporate America and Wall Street? Or a kind of nationalist xenophobia? Corporate America and Wall Street don't seem to have learned a thing from what's happened over this tempestuous last year. Where do they think the Bannon version of Trump came from? I'll tell you where it came from. It came from the cauldron of anger and cynicism welling up from a shrinking and ever more anxious working and middle class. It came from millions of working people so convinced the game is rigged against them that they were prepared and are still prepared to topple everything to get real change. It came from voters whipped into a socialism for the rich, while they have been getting the losing end of the stick, declining wages, mass firings, less job security. And it came from people who, during the Great Recession, lost their jobs, their homes, their savings, and watched while Wall Street got bailed out, and not a single high executive on Wall Street went to prison. The so-called moderate, business-friendly, centrist, mainstream policies that big business and Wall Street are pushing, and delighted that Gary Cohn is now able to implement in the Trump White House, will not reverse these sentiments. In fact, they'll add to these sentiments. If Democrats had any idea about what this moment means in American history, they would put forward a populist progressive agenda now. This is their time, not a mainstream centrist business-friendly, Wall Street-friendly agenda, an agenda that is really going to help widen the circle of prosperity, help provide more security for most people. An agenda that means we are no longer a country having the largest divide between rich and poor and middle class of any country in the advanced world. More and more and more of our earnings and our wealth going to the very top. More and more Americans working harder than ever and getting nowhere, and worried that their children will not even do as well as they are doing. If corporate America and Wall Street learned a thing from what has happened over the past year, they would understand they have got to push fundamental reforms. But as I tried to do when we were last together, I want to give you some good news. I want to leaven the outrage Trump's unpopularity is beginning to affect other elected Republicans in Washington. Republican officials around the country are becoming anxious, even in ruby red districts. They sweated out, you remember last week, a closer than expected victory in a House race in a Kansas congressional district that Trump, by the way, had carried by 27 points. The Republican victor there in a special election won by only 7 points. Another stress test for the Republican Party arrives tomorrow in a suburb of Georgia. In a special election for a House seat, 18 candidates are running to replace Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price. That's in Georgia's 6th congressional district. All eyes are on Democrat Jon Ossoff. The latest round of polling shows that he is in or around the low or mid 40s. If he gets over 50%, he wins. That's it. Otherwise, he goes to a runoff election. He may do very well. But still, it is amazing that he has done so well. This is a deep red district. Tom Price won it by a landslide in victories every 2 years. Before that, portions of this district were represented by Newt Gingrich and Johnny Isakson. It is a rich Republican establishment suburban district along Atlanta's northern suburbs where Chamber of Commerce Republicans usually prevail. The fact that they are running scared right now is very major news. And this week, by the way, congressional recess, another week of congressional recess means that it is another week to try to hold your member of Congress accountable for pushing back Trump. There have been some real successes just the past week in terms of holding members of Congress accountable. For example, a member of indivisible Gainesville changed Republican Representative Ted Yoho's mind on the release of Trump's taxes. In Colorado, several of you confronted Representative Mike Kaufman on Medicaid and asked him to choose between you and Trump. In Pennsylvania, some of you told Representative Ryan Costello that without the Affordable Care Act, you would be dead. In New Jersey, you pushed Representative Leonard Lance, again, to quit playing games with our health care and get committed and become committed, and you did get a commitment from him, as a matter of fact, that he would never support any attempt to repeal health reform that makes it harder or more expensive for people with pre-existing conditions to get health care. And many of you joined arms in a tax march across the country this weekend to demand that Donald Trump release his tax returns and that the tax system is fair to all of us. By the way, when you confront or deal with your members of Congress, hopefully this week, tell them to demand a vote on the Presidential Tax Transparency Act. Talk about transparency. Talk about trying to avoid and overcome the secrecy that the Trump administration represents. And now your questions, Michael Rohrer. I want to support Democrats in other states, such as Jon Ossoff, but I have reservations donating to campaigns on the other side of the country. I considered it a big offense when outside groups donated to California's Proposition 8. How important are out-of-state donations to campaigns such as Ossoff's? Are there or should there be a limit on out-of-state campaign donations? Michael, I don't blame you in terms of resenting or finding it a little bit troublesome when you have a lot of campaign donations coming from out of state. But let me just say that the big difference is not where the campaign contribution comes from, it's whether it comes from somebody who is providing small campaign contributions because they really don't have and cannot afford larger campaign contributions, or whether they are somebody who is extremely wealthy and is basically drowning our campaign system in big campaign contributions. If you are a small contributor, I urge you to contribute wherever. Bruce Baker, can you explain the position regarding Social Security that defends the income cap limitation? I must be missing something because it seems so obvious to me that the cap should be eliminated. Bruce, it seems obvious to me as well. The cap right now is something like $120,000, the last time I looked. And that means that every dollar that you earn above that cap is not taxed for Social Security purposes. And yet we also know that the wealthier members of our society live much longer than the poorer people in our society, and that means they're collecting Social Security for much longer. So why not take the cap off of the income subject to Social Security? Two more questions. Carol Hartman. I'm attending a town hall meeting with my Republican congressional representative. What is one important question I should ask him? Carol, you can start by asking him why he supports Donald Trump, if he still does. And if he gives you an answer, then follow that up. Follow that up with Trump's lies, Trump's conflicts of interest, Trump's attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Trump's appointment of Scott Pruitt to the Environmental Protection Agency, who wants to eliminate environmental protections for all intents and purposes, his appointment of Betsy DeVos at Education, who wants to basically take on public education, his appointment of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, for all the reasons that we are concerned about voting rights and civil rights. Moni E. Moni. That's a great name, Moni. What makes you believe we have a chance to take our country back and replace it on the path of a real democracy and away from the interests of big pockets? It seems clear that Trump will do what he wants in spite of laws and regulations. No one seems to be able to stop him. Pessimism may not be a choice, but the horizon seems dark. Well, Moni E. Moni, I get it. I understand why sometimes the future seems pretty dark. There is a large dark cloud right now hanging over America and hanging over the world. But I would say the silver lining on that dark cloud is that millions of Americans are waking up to the fact that politics is not a spectator sport, that they've got to get involved in any way they can, and they are doing it. We're putting aside small differences because we care about our democracy. We care about our system of government. We are patriots in the sense that we love this country. True patriots in the sense that we are not simply going to march behind an autocrat, an authoritarian, somebody who has no respect for the press, for the courts, for the truth. No, the measure of a true patriot is how much they are willing to devote, how much time and attention and how much of themselves they're willing to devote to this country. And right now, we need you. Moni E. Moni, get busy. I want to add just thanks tonight to Yael Bridge for her help as producer, and also Sasha Leitman for her help as associate producer. These are not easy times. I want to thank you for joining us. This is the end of tonight's Resistance Report. I'll see you tomorrow.